This presentation we're giving today, of course, you probably know every once in a while I give a Gettysburg Commercialization presentation, and I have different subtopics within the commercialization overall arching topic, I guess. And so this program is more, I have a lot of photographs to share, and obviously I'm going to talk about a lot of places that different people in the audience have been to over the years when they visited Gettysburg. So it's a way to reminisce also. You know, in a general sense, you know, the battle that was fought here caused people to want to come to Gettysburg and see where the battle was fought. So commercialization really started out of the need to set up some kind of infrastructure for the people who wanted to come to Gettysburg to see the battlefield. And right away, the local people realized that not only did people need a place to stay, a hotel, or a place to eat, maybe a restaurant or a cafeteria, but they also felt the need to buy items associated with the battle. And battlefield souvenirs early on were a major business operation in our town. There's this great letter written by George Arnold, who had a store in the center of the town in August of 1863. And he's writing to a friend of his in the Army, and he's saying that the area where the battle was fought is a huge draw for visitors, and we should make the most out of this opportunity, and we should create some tourist infrastructure because of the large amount of people that are coming here. And he says somewhere in the letter that, you know, people who come to the battlefield to see it would travel across the Atlantic Ocean because it's such an interesting place. And it was George Arnold that set up early on some people in his store to give tours of the battlefield. And he had a tour booklet that he produced and a tour map of the battlefield. And eventually in 1878, he built the Gettysburg Prospect Tower, so that people could pay money and go up in the tower and look over the battlefield on East Cemetery Hill and, you know, learn about the battle. And, you know, around his tower, sort of a tourist enterprise was established. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association had been purchasing land around the battlefield, purchased East Cemetery Hill. They allowed him to build his tower on it. They also had tents, which you might look at as motel rooms early on. This is 1885. They had a group of people that would take people around the battlefield in carriages, and they had a souvenir stand. So everything you need was right there on Cemetery Hill early on. The first real person to delve into what we consider a museum would be Joel Danner. And you can see, you can see in this image, which is Washington's birthday, 1892, a group of townspeople in front of what we refer to as the Fahnestock Building. And probably in the late 1880s, he had established a little museum there beside the Fahnestock Building. And you can see the Danner Museum sign. And also, it's interesting, there's a painting hanging on the outside wall. And that, no doubt, is the painting of the Gettysburg militia marching through Gettysburg prior to the war, if you're familiar with that image. It appears in William Frassinito's book, Gettysburg, the Bicentennial Album. So it's, you know, one of the major artifacts associated with the battle. Oh, I have a close-up of it. So if you kind of can recognize it there. I don't have the best image of it. Here he is in front of a pump on Baltimore Street. And the shop, the Fahnestock Building, will be here on the left. And it was said that this is the pump in which Juba Early stopped at, and his horse drank water out of that trough while he was writing the ransom for the supplies in Gettysburg on June 26 prior to the battle. We actually know it was a pump a little bit farther down in front of the McLean house. But here on the pump, he has a framed object, and that is obviously, when you blow it up, it is the ransom note that Juba Early wrote that was sent to the town fathers, and then David Kendallhart had written a reply to him. So early on, the town has a museum that is showing off artifacts associated with events of the battle. And the trough that Juba Early's horse drank out of to this day is still owned by the Gettysburg Tour Center. And it's kind of, it's an old trough, and it's kind of, not the most attractive thing, but I've been trying to get it for years to put it on display here in the museum. I think it would be kind of cool as one of the early, artifacts associated with the town. Now, Danner had moved his museum in about 1900 to the other side of Baltimore Street. This would be today where I think it's called the Lincoln Building. It was called the Apple Building. It's where the comic book shop is. So, and that would be where Ping's used to be. I don't know what they're doing with Ping's. They're opening something up there, aren't they? But this building no longer stands. But also, the second floor was a photographic studio run in different years by the Mumpers and the Snyder and Pensel. But you can see the photographic studio window there. And again, you can see the same Danner Museum sign. We are very fortunate to have photographs that were taken inside the Danner Museum of his displays. And one of them illustrates the items that were sold to the Pennsylvania State Museum, which includes the musket used by John Burns in the War of 1812. Doesn't really say in the battle. But if you go to the Pennsylvania State Library or Pennsylvania State Museum in Harrisburg, they have that musket on display and some of these items on display today. So they own this collection. And, the collection's numbered, and these are the different things that they got from Danner. We also have a couple photographs of other items that were inside of the Danner Museum. This group of relics found on the battle is on display in the basement of the GAR Hall today, if you've seen that. When the guys would have their meetings there, we would meet downstairs, and often we'd, that was just kind of just sitting there on the table. But, one thing about Danner was he had a museum, but everything in the museum was for sale. And, in Gettysburg, whether something is a museum or whether it is actually just a relic shop is kind of vague. And I think, my friend Eric, we talk about this all the time. He has a Gettysburg Museum on History, Gettysburg Museum of History. But, if you sell stuff, is it actually a museum? And this goes on for all the museums in town. For instance, the old Charlie Weaver Museum we're going to learn about, later today if you hang around. They had a drum from a member of Company K, 1st Pennsylvania Reserves. And I get the feeling that the family donated the drum to that museum. But it's a private museum. And when it went out of business, they sold the drum. So, and I think the family is like, well, how could they do that? We donated it to them and then they sold it. But, is it a museum? Is it a private collection? These things are iffy. But I'd maintain that most of these museums in Gettysburg are just private collections and not public repositories. And I'd say this to everyone: don't donate stuff to these museums. Sell your stuff to these museums. Because they're just, when they go to business, they're just going to sell them anyway. And this is just how it is. I'm not mad about it. I wanted to point out that some of the stuff, and all Danner stuff was for sale in his museum. And he had numbers on his stuff, but I think his numbers might not allude to that specific item. Like the number 27 might allude to found in the wheat field. Because I see the same numbers over and over again on different items. And these Danner items come up for sale on eBay, or you can buy them at the Horse Soldier. And these shells with the bases and the Danner paint on them and the numbers sell for like $1,000 or $2,000 each. So, he's got some really interesting items. What about the artillery shell alarm clock? Ding dong, you're dead. Or the cannonball oil lamp. That's right. Let's drill a hole in it, empty all the powder out of it, at least maybe all the powder. Put some kerosene on it, put a wick on it, and light it on fire. I'm just not feeling that. But I think we're incredibly fortunate to have these images of these museums. And also, I think early on, people realized that you had to be all things to all people. So you're a museum for people who want to come and see artifacts relating to the battle. You are a tourist shop for somebody who wants to get information about touring the battlefield. You are a gift shop, and you can sell things in your store. And, Danner had a tour book of the battlefield. So not only does the shop act as, a museum, but you go in there and you can rent a tour guide to take you around, or buy a tour booklet or a tour map, or buy a 5-gallon demijohn of water from the Springs Hotel. Yes. I like this advertisement because the Museum of Rare Relics and Curiosities. And of course, we're talking about water from the Springs Hotel west of town that had medicinal qualities to it. So I think that when you look at some of these older museums, I think they realize they can't make it as simply a museum. You have to have some other ways to make money. And the selling of relics is tied into all these early museums. John Good, he lived on Middle Street, and he had carts that he took around town, especially on days where it was an anniversary, and his little souvenir and relic cart could be seen around town. And you just stop, you park somewhere, and you bought items off of the relic wagon. And he did have a factory on Middle Street. The building no longer stands. It was out Middle Street near the base of Seminary Ridge, but we're fortunate to have a photograph of it. I don't know if anybody is a member of that site, Gettysburg and Postcards, but just yesterday, someone put up an image of a bill of sale, I guess it was, from the Gettysburg Novelty Works. So you can see that it's big business. And, Jacob Mumper had a photographic studio at Devil's Den, but he also sold souvenirs. There's the Batchelder isometrical map, and, books, and I'm sure tour guides worked out of the souvenir shop at Devil's Den. And you can see his advertisement: view souvenir albums, relics, and canes from all parts of the battlefield, and refreshments. And again, it's sort of a museum. Blind Davy ran a souvenir shop at the base of Little Round Top. Of course, you might question why Blind Davy has a gun. he would just shoot fire in your general direction, But Blind Davy had been blinded. His name is David Martin Luther Weichert, the youngest son of Jacob Weichert on the farm behind Little Round Top. And he was injured during a premature explosion of dynamite while he was helping to install the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad at Round Top Park. And as a courtesy to his being blinded, he was able to run this stand. Now, this stand was already there because a guy named James Royster, a United States colored infantry soldier from Gettysburg, had run the stand there prior to him. So it was a souvenir stand at Little Round Top. The Sherfies, obviously, they run a pretty successful souvenir stand at their house, at the peach orchard. And, you could go around, you could see the artillery shell in the tree on the side of their house. I'm sure they would show you bullet holes on the back side of their building, and then you would buy peaches. And if you were really fortunate, the Sherfies would get out from behind, I'm sure, the counter, the last jar of peaches from the 1863 peach orchard, which they would then sell to you. And you can see the granddaughter of the Sherfies, Mr. Charles Peffer, has one of the 1863 peach jars there in her hand. Now, there was the Penrose Myers, who had established a store in Gettysburg in 1876. He had a jewelry store and souvenir store on Baltimore Street. He also, for many years, ran a successful refreshment stand and relic shop and museum on Oak Ridge, just at the tower. And you can see, we're talking about like flank markers for like the 12th Massachusetts Infantry. And so it was right there. And to give you an idea, so there it is. And look, museum. It's a museum. But again, are these museums? Or are they just glorified relic shops or gift shops? And again, I don't think it matters one way or another. But he had that gift shop and museum there at that location during the 1938 reunion when Roosevelt was speaking at the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, and there's like 200,000 people in the crowd. Can you imagine how busy he was that day? Having the only game in town just right up there on top of the ridge. And, his place is on private property, just on the other side of the stone wall from the park. And maybe they broke down some of the stone wall to put an entrance. Maybe. I think that's interesting. I would say the oldest continuously operational museum in the town is the Jenny Wade House. It has been a museum since 1901. Now, there are different stages of operation of the museum, but we definitely have, this is a rotograph 1904 postcard of it. And here in the newspaper, we have accounts that in 1901, May 1901, Robert Miller is opening up a museum there. And just a little history. So Jacob Kitts Miller, who had married Anna Garlack, they purchased half of the Jenny Wade House in 1867 and eventually purchased the whole house. It's a duplex. And he had two daughters. One of his daughters marries Robert Miller, and the other daughter married Jacob Mumper. And so Miller opens up the Jenny Wade House Museum. But early on, Jacob Mumper, his brother-in-law, is assisting him in the business and supplies all the postcards and all the souvenirs that are being sold at that location. And those two are much more about the gift shop and the souvenirs that are being sold than the Jenny Wade House itself. Although Miller gives tours of the Jenny Wade House. And you can read in the paper a little bit about it here. I would also mention that it's free. It's a free museum. Early on, all these museums are free. They're trying to draw you into the free museum so you can buy stuff from their gift shop. Their main means of making money is gift shop. I remember that there's a guy named Jim Weeks who wrote a book about the commercialization of Gettysburg. And honestly, nobody should be more into the subject than me, but I don't know if I liked his book. But he kept making these mass, like he would take these little things and make like a mountain out of a molehill. Little did Jacob Mumper know when he started to sell postcards at the Jenny Wade House Museum that he was creating an infrastructure of tourism and commercialization that would span the decades. Yeah, I bet you he did know. He's trying to make money. But postcards are tied into these early commercial enterprises. Here's a 1903 postcard by the Detroit Photograph Company. Again, it opened up in 1901. And again, highlighted there is free museum. So, and of course, here's another view of it. Look, they moved the sign down a little. The most famous relic or souvenir associated with the town of Gettysburg came out of the Jenny Wade House Museum. The souvenir replica of the Jenny Wade dough tray. It's an actual replica of the dough tray that Jenny was using when she was killed during the battle. And I brag about this often. I'm sure it's really not true, but I say that I have the largest collection of Jenny Wade dough trays in existence. I actually have met some other people, and I'm like, wow, I thought I had a lot of them. Okay, so maybe that's not true. The door on the Jenny Wade House has got to be one of the best known artifacts associated with the town. And no matter what you might hear, the Jenny Wade House door is the original door that was there during the battle with the original hole in it. Unless someone took it off years ago and made an exact replica with the exact holes in the exact spot and then put that up and then sold the other one to a collector. That's like one of the conspiracy theories going around town. Another conspiracy theory you might hear is the Jenny Wade House was moved. You hear that? People say, oh yeah, it used to be on another location down the street and they built a Holiday Inn and they picked it up and moved it up the hill and put it where it is now. That is absolutely not true, but you hear it. Now, it wasn't until the 1960s, and I don't have the exact date, I was looking at it the other day, maybe 1962, that the Jenny Wade House became part of a conglomeration of museums that eventually became the Gettysburg Tour Center. And that's when they started charging money to go in to the Jenny Wade House Museum. And I don't know when I first was in the building. I remember the first time we came here, I wanted to go, but my dad thought it was a tourist trap and wouldn't pay the price for all of us to go. But originally, they had some kind of audio in the walls. So you walked in and there was a tour tape that told you about the Jenny Wade House. And you can see, as told at the house with talking walls. And early on, they had a Jenny Wade wax figure. I regret to say that I never got my picture taken with the Jenny Wade wax figure. But this was put up by a friend of ours on our Gettysburg and Vintage Postcards site not too long ago. And I do remember the wax figure being outside. I don't think it stayed outside continuously, but I think they had it inside, and in summer days they would bring it outside and it was standing there where the statue to Jenny Wade now stands. You know, that statue was not built or not erected until like 1984 or something like that. 1988, something like that. So if anybody remembers, there's the Jenny Wade waxed figure that was out at the house. Yeah. And another thing that I do remember, and this is the first time I visited, I don't know when it was done. I'm going to guess it was done in the late 1970s. And Mark Nesbitt actually was the person who came up with the idea and put it in there for them. But they had a mannequin, and it had a white mannequin face, and you went in, and they put on a video, and a video camera threw Mark Nesbitt's face onto the face of the mannequin. And I'm assuming that it came from the ceiling down on. I don't know how they did it if you're standing there, but I remember it very clearly. And Mark, then, as he talked, it looked like the mannequin was talking to you. And he told the story of how Jenny Wade and her family were in the house and killed during the battle. And then he was one of the soldiers that broke in and helped Jenny up the stairs and through the wall and down into the other side of the cellar. And it was, I kind of liked it. So they went from the talking walls to this talking mannequin. And then when you walk through the rest of the house, they had like a pamphlet that you walked through and you could tour the house. And of course, I'm fascinated by Jenny Wade, so I was always fascinated by the Jenny Wade house. And I went there a bunch of times on my visits. So here's like a 1960s image of it. And then I don't know if you remember, but behind the Jenny Wade house, there was a place called Old Town. It was a building, I think today the Holiday Inn or the Inns of 63 have like an exercise room at that location associated with the motel. But they had a place where you walked into, and it was little wax vignettes of different shops, and they had wax figures, and you can see they had like a barber and a blacksmith and a general store and a stable. And these wax figures actually came from the original Ye Old Gettysburg Village that was across the street. Originally, the wax figures, you walked down, they had little buildings and exhibits, and they had these wax figures in them, and that didn't work out. So they moved them to the Jenny Wade house, and it was more, I guess, bang for your buck. Not only did you get to see the Jenny Wade house, but you learned about the town through these wax motifs. And maybe Glenn this afternoon will talk more about those figures in the old Gettysburg Village. I don't know if he'll talk about that. But, I went to the old Gettysburg Village when I was young. So here's my family. That's my pants. So, and to give you an idea of what it was like. And there was a little carriage you could sit in. Here, we're looking across where they had the gazebo. That's like the back of, it was called the Jenny Wade Bakery then, looking towards the Holiday Inn. See the Heritage Inn sign? And we're looking, that's the Jenny Wade house across the street. So that could have been when I was first in it. I don't remember too much about this. This was like 1972. Now, Lee's headquarters is another of the early museums in our town and one of the longest lasting museums in our town. It opened up in, I think, like 1918 or 1919. And you can see that Clyde Daly bought the building. This is like a 1903 photograph of it. And you can see he put dormers on it by 1919. I guess he lived upstairs, and he had one section of the house open as a Lee Museum. He also had a campground beside it with cottages. And later, this is purchased by the Larson family, and they slowly removed the cottages and built a motel around it. But here's a 1940 image of it, and you can see again, free. The object of your museum is not to make money. It's to draw people in so they buy souvenirs, or artifacts that are in your museum. Yeah, this has been in the museum for a while, but I'm willing to part with it. Yeah. And then you could buy like 2 bullets that hit in midair or something like that. Yeah. So it's you can see some of the things associated with the museum there in the picture. Here's an advertisement for it early on. One of the finest collection of Civil War relics and firearms. Here's another postcard packet, and you can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. I have a couple images from inside the museum. This isn't the best, but it's from part of our collection. I think it's from one of the Mumper collections we have here. And you can see just the vast amount of stuff that was on the wall. So I worked for Andy Larson a number of years ago for a short time, and he paid me to do research on his items, and he basically ended up tearing the museum apart and redesigning it so it had a lot less stuff on the wall, and he had informational displays about the things on the wall. But again, here's another image of the interior of Lee's museum. And I helped him with the history of his brochure. One interesting thing about Lee's headquarters, Lee Museum, that I was interested in, is the fact that there was a fence up there. Here is the Gettysburg College just sent us this over recently, but it's a late 1950s photograph. Lee's headquarters is behind us, and in front of us, that is the back of the Larson's Quality Inn, or I should say Larson's cottage that would eventually be torn down, and a restaurant would be built at that location, variously known as the Dutch Pantry, General Lee's Family Restaurant, Muldoon's, High Point on Seminary Ridge, Appalachian Brewery. It had a bunch, JD's Bar and Grill. It had a bunch of names over the years. But this fence was moved up to Lee's headquarters in 1955. And it was actually the fence that was on Baltimore Street, on Baltimore and Lefevre Street for many years at the entrance to the junior high school. And you can see there, if you look how the fence is broken there, that's in that sign, that's the same fence. And when I was a kid, it was there. Let's see, do I have a close-up of it? There it is. And you can kind of see that broken section of it there. And when Larson's Quality Inn, when Andy Larson sold it to the Belmont Corporation, they sold most of the stuff in the museum. And I told Andy, Andy had gotten the museum, his family had gotten from Clyde Daly, who originated the museum, and he wanted to keep it together, and I think they had some kind of gentleman agreement that when he sold it, they would keep the stuff together. And then they bought it and they sold it immediately because it's worth money, And I think I also have this realization that people get angry when their favorite restaurant closes down or their favorite museum closes down, and they want to place blame on somebody like they should have never toured. Why did it go out of business? Well, it's a natural ebb and flow in these restaurants or motels or tourist attractions. And, Lee's headquarters basically got sold to the Battlefield Trust, but before they sold it, all the items in it were sold off to different people. And private collectors have much of that stuff today. Some of the really cool stuff was sold or given to American Battlefield Trust. But just as an aside, so Andy in the early 1990s wanted to sell and retire the Larson's Quality Inn. Him and his brother were the owners of it at that time. And I wrote a booklet for him. He paid me to do it. so that he could then show prospective buyers a history of the building in the museum. And I still have an original copy of it. So if anybody else has a copy of it, it's probably rare. And then after he sold it, I took the research and just wrote a book out of it. That's the origins of the story I wrote about Lee's headquarters. But, that museum had been there from 1919 until, 2013. So again, one of the longest continuously operational museums in the town. Jenny Wade House is still going strong. Also, an early museum, and in a show, I know that some of these things could be considered attractions. Like I didn't put the Land of Little Horses in here as a museum or a fantasy land. They're attractions. So, but this could be an attraction, the cyclorama. It came to Gettysburg in 1913, and until the late 1950s, it was active on Cemetery Hill. It is right where the Gettysburg Tour Center is now today, where the double-decker tour buses are. And, of course, in the late 1950s, the park got it. They built the Cyclorama Center, which they completed in, I think it's November 19th, 1962. And then the Cyclorama moved into that building. And, of course, that building eventually would be torn down, and it was moved to its current location during the 2008 year. Another early museum in our town is the Wills House, the house in which Abraham Lincoln put the finishing touches on the Gettysburg Address. And it tells, the museum there tells the story of the Gettysburg Address. And here is a 1914 image. This is from the University of Michigan, the Lincoln Highway Digital Collection. And I saw that they had this. There was an article about it. They made this available, this digital collection. I got on it, put in Gettysburg to see what they had for the Lincoln Highway here. Whole bunch of really neat stuff, including this 1914 image. See, it says Lincoln Room. They actually had, it looks like it's a banner or it's painted onto the building there. Here is a 1917 image from a book about the Gettysburg Address, and it's titled The Lincoln Room Museum. So I guess you went up there into this room, and, they had photographs of Lincoln there, and you were inspired by, the place where Lincoln had spent a night and perhaps put a few finishing touches on the Gettysburg Address. So the Lincoln Room Museum was there, again, from like 1914 until, I'm going to say the mid-1990s. And you can see free Lincoln Museum. Visitors welcome. Now, the drugstore was downstairs and had a door on the side here that you went in, and they built a stairway to get up to it. So it has a different appearance than it does now. Here's a 1970s view of the Ree and Derrick drugstore. Anybody go into the drugstore? Yeah, I remember pretty well. Here's a 1960s postcard taken from the top of the bank building, looking across to it. And you can see the drugstore actually spanned the bottoms of those two buildings. They kind of broke through the wall there. But to get to the Lincoln Room, you had to go in a door there and up some stairs, a stairway they put in to get to it. And here's a 1962 or 3 advertisement for it. And, seeing here the 6-foot tall life-size figure of Lincoln. Adults, 50 cents, children, 25. Open 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Isn't that wild? And, here's how I remember it. So how many people were in the Lincoln Room Museum? Good. I think, and I'm lucky today. I feel fortunate that I did this. But there was a time in the late 70s when I came here, and I went into every single attraction, whether I thought it was good or not. It was just something I did. And now, so I have memories of some of these things. And of course, they changed over the years. But here's your Lincoln figure. And they had like an audio presentation that went along with it as you walk from room to room. And they had different things on display. And of course, I have a large collection of pamphlets or brochures from these early places. Eventually, the town purchased the building, and then the Park Service purchased it from the town, and they opened it up, and they renovated inside of the building, and they opened it up. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Lincoln House Museum, the Wheels House, is closed permanently. There are some issues with the mildew inside the building, and they've closed it down, and we don't know when it's going to reopen. So, but again, these museums come and go and come and go and come and go. So a couple of them at the end here, I'll tell you, you should go visit because they probably won't be around if you just want to get a memory of it. One of the ones that I have fond memories of is the Shields Museum. And you can see where the Shields Museum was. This is Stone Avenue. The park restrooms are there on the left. And this was a refreshment stand, a gas station, and a free museum. And he had cabins there. He had a campground. You can see the Peace Light Monument, and there's the Reynolds and Buford statue. It was run by Arthur Sheeds, Ott Sheeds. He's from Chambersburg, but he opened up the museum, gift shop, and restaurant in 1925. And he ran it until he died. His wife and sons, I knew a few of his sons, ran it until I think it might have closed in 79 or 80. On some of my first visits, I stopped there at the museum and would buy a soda and check out all the artifacts that they had from that area of the battlefield. Like Lee's headquarters was filled with stuff found around the Lee's headquarters. And this was filled with stuff found around that building. I remember they had the door to the McPherson barn with bullets in it on display. I think that still exists somewhere in a collection. I don't know if it's in the Gettysburg National Military Park or not. But the Shields Museum, they closed it down in 1983. That's when I know that they closed it. The family got rid of it. And there was an auction in 1985 in which they sold all the stuff inside the museum. So a lot of it's in private collections today. The House of Bender. Do you guys remember that the House of Bender, if you went inside, above all the display cases, there was a long wall with Civil War artifacts from the Battle of Gettysburg on display? And that was sold off years ago. But here's a 1963 advertisement. Oh, they got the wrong year of the building. It's 1818, not 1842. Look at our Confederate flag in the window. Yeah. But there was a good, they had the Hallmark card store back there. Was Zerfing's Hardware for a while. The Gettysburg National Museum. And the Gettysburg National Museum basically is the Rosenstiel Museum. And to make the story simple, after the battle was over, John Rosenstiel came here and I think he may have lived near Emmitsburg, and he collected stuff from the battlefield. He claims that he found that sharpshooter rifle at Devil's Den on like July 5th. But he had souvenir displays that he collected. And he started in 1886 a museum near Little Round Top. And you can see it, Little Round Top Restaurant, or sometimes called Round Top Museum. So 1886. And it was across the street from Round Top Park that had been opened by the railroad company in 1884. And again, you need to be all things to all people. He had a dance hall. And later, the dance hall was used as a roller skating rink. You hear people talk about roller skating in the dance hall. And you can buy all kinds of stuff there. And he was fortunate that there was a trolley stop when the Gettysburg Electric trolley was active in front of his building. This is not the best picture, but up here you can kind of see it says Round Top Museum. Now, it was his nephew, George, that in 1929 purchased property and opened up the Rosenstiel Museum across from the entrance of the National Cemetery on the Tawnytown Road. So this is his nephew. And he moved his uncle's collection in there. Although I should tell you, that building at the intersection of the Wheatfield Road and Little Round Top stood until the 1980s. I remember that building standing there until the park tore it down. But they moved here in 1929. Over the years, the building had like 9 different major renovations done to it. And you can see this is one of the early, these two I just showed you, 2 of the early versions of it. And again, free. And here you can see after they started putting additions onto it. I went there as a kid. I guess I'm fortunate that I went there as a kid before the Park Service took it over and renovated it. So I have memories of what it used to look like before the renovations were completed. And I remember when you walked in, one of the things they highlighted that really affected me were they had paintings on the wall of the last surviving veterans of the American Civil War. And you can see there's Albert Wilson, who's got a statue near the Sycamore. And then, of course, Walter Williams. Turns out that he was not really a Civil War veteran from Galveston, Texas. And here was the entrance sign to the Gettysburg National Museum. And this is off of the Emmitsburg Road. I don't know if anybody remembers all these signs along there. I remember up here, Autotronic Tapes. That building still stands. Oh, this is the Gettysburg Motor Lodge. So the entrance was right there. And boy, did I love that walking tour, the final fjord with Bruce Catton. That kind of dates this, I think, to like 1963 or something. And, of course, here's our brochure, the electric map. Here's a bus group there. I thought Eric put this on his website for Gettysburg Museum of History. I thought it would be kind of interesting to show that. And this is kind of how I remember it. And then, of course, they had there the electric map. Probably the most famous of all Gettysburg tourist attractions in our area. And it was designed in 1939 by Joseph Rosenstiel, the son of George D. Rosenstiel. And, I mean, look at that. Lights, action, war. Yeah. And, I was one who loved the electric map. I knew different people had different feelings about it, but I really liked it. And I thought it gave you a great introduction to the battle. Do you know, originally the electric map was in the middle of the building. If you can picture the visitor center, in your mind here, and you walk in the front lobby, and you have the long desk where the Rangers were in the gift shop, and then you walk through some double doors, and you remember there was a hole? That's where the electric map used to be. And then later they built a rear addition onto it, pulled it out of that hole, and moved it back. So when we saw it in the 1980s, I don't remember when they moved it, 1970s and 1980s, that was a different location than it is in that particular photo. But this is probably the room that we all saw. And they ran, the electric map. Originally, a guy was talking into a microphone and flicking the switches, and then later they came up with a tape to put onto it, and by the time the park did it, it was just automated through a tape. So the Park Service took over the Rose and Steel building in 1971. They purchased it, and slowly they changed it, and I think they took full operation of it in 1974, and so by the late 70s, they ripped out a lot of the displays and put their own displays in. But there's a more modern picture of it. And of course, it was there until closing day of 2008. And then, I was at the meetings when they talked about what to do with the electric map. It was obvious at the meetings, the Rose and Steel family was there. The Park Service didn't want any part of this thing being in their new visitor center. And so they put it in storage. Eventually, it was sold to the gentleman in Hanover who put it back together. And occasionally, he has shows of the electric map, and you can still go see it today. They eventually tore down the building. So here they were tearing it down. Don't remember off the top of my head. I do a video where I talk about it. 2009. And then the cyclorama, of course, was torn down after they moved stuff to the new visitor center. And boy, that's a horrible image, isn't it? So in 2008, the new visitor center opened up. Other museums, the Horse and Buggy Museum, which was there from 1955 until, I believe, 1968. We're on the Harrisburg Road. Off to our right is the Gettysburg High School. That's the Josiah Benner farm that was used as a hospital afterwards, and the barn was. But basically, a guy from Pittsburgh had a huge collection of horse and buggies that he collected from the 1920s until the 1950s. He died suddenly, and his brothers wanted to put his massive display of carriages somewhere. So they settled on Gettysburg. They moved all the carriages here, and you could go through the carriage museum and see carriages from all across the country that he had purchased. I was never in the carriage museum. So I don't know if anybody else here was. My friend Brian Kennel says after the carriage museum went out, they turned it into a teen disco club. And he was in there a few times. So the Dobbin House. So, the Dobbin House has always kind of been a Gettysburg landmark. And in 1940, John Lippy purchased it. John Lippy had formerly been the manager at the Lincoln Room Museum in the Wills House. And he opened up a museum there. It was a historical house tour. It was much like the Shriver House. You went in it, and they walked from room to room and talked about the colonial period and how people lived in Gettysburg at that time. And they gave a little history of the house. And John Lippy wrote a book about the house. He's really the one who popularized the idea that it was used as an underground railroad stop. And then in 1955, John Lippy sold it, and someone opened up a diorama in the Dobbin House. And the Dobbin House diorama was there from 1955 through 1976. And I think it was in 1973, I came to Gettysburg on one of our family vacations, and my dad and I went down there. And so I was fortunate enough to see it. And I should have looked for photographs of the diorama. Jackie White has some photographs of the diorama. But you see, 36,000 figures and lights with sound and action. And I have a few brochures from the diorama. Again, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So we're trying to make it easy for tourists to visit. In 1959, we had the Hall of Presidents open. And I don't know about you guys, I am a sucker for presidential wax figures. I just love that. They actually renovated an existing Victorian building on Baltimore Street, and they put this large canopy on top of it. And of course, initially, they had wax figures of the presidents, and then they added first ladies to it, and then eventually they added Eisenhower at Gettysburg, and you could walk through and you could check it out. And not too long ago, last year, one of our people here, Michaela, interviewed the lady who made all the dresses for the first ladies that were on display there. And I think at some point she's going to do a video on it. The dresses are all their gowns they wore at their inauguration, based on photos of the first ladies. And again, the whole presidents is something I always was interested in going to. Now, in this program, I'm not going to tell you, hey, this was a really good museum or this was a really bad museum. I try to disassociate myself from that. I think when I was a kid, I think I realized a lot of these places were glitzy or hokey or tourist traps. And, when the Gettysburg Tourist Center came about in the early 1960s, late 1950s, they came up with this idea of the package plan. And you would come to Gettysburg, buy a single ticket, and that ticket would get you into the double-decker tour, the Jenny Wade House, the Hall of Presidents, the Lincoln Train Museum, the Wills House, lunch at the Battlefield Cafeteria. So these things were all tied together. And so I think that a lot of these museums could not have survived on their own by themselves. But as part of the package plan, you felt like you were getting more for your money when you visited Gettysburg. Sam and I went to the Hall of Presidents during its last few days of operation when it closed. And boy, I'm sure I wrote down here when it closed. Can't remember off the top of my head. But obviously there are a couple of people in the room here that were at the auction of all the items that were at the Hall of Presidents. We'll learn about that later this afternoon. Let's see. So 2016, November 2016, here's Sam with Abraham Lincoln. He's very excited to meet Abraham Lincoln. The Charlie Weaver Museum also opened in 1959. And we're not going to talk too much about that because obviously this afternoon we have a whole program about Charlie Weaver. But Cliff Arquette opened up a museum here in Gettysburg. And here's some postcards of the original museum when it opened. And, it highlighted little figurines that Charlie Weaver carved himself. And, the brochures, the early brochures highlighted that fact. And he also had wax figures of his Hollywood friends that were in it, like Tennessee Ernie Ford. Here's a photograph of inside. He had artifacts and souvenirs on display later. And, of course, one of my favorite things in the bottom right-hand corner, the I think he called him Johnny Yank, like a combination of Billy Reb and Johnny Yank, or it's kind of a mixture of those two, right? You get the idea. Billy Reb, and is that how it is? Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, yeah. But it's a crossover. And then here is a more modern photograph of it. And I liked, of course, that later eventually added dioramas to it of the Civil War. And I loved those little dioramas. And again, it also closed down and had an auction about the same time as a Hall of Presidents. So here's Sam and I looking at the Pickett's Charge diorama. And when I was a kid, outside in the courtyard, they had a bunch of exhibits with wax figures. They had like a half-scale balloon, the Intrepid, out there on display. And here's an image looking back towards the back of the museum. I remember in that building over there, they had like a gigantic Abraham Lincoln, like from the Lincoln Memorial. And, you know, this is the time that I came to Gettysburg a lot. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. When we came, I have fond memories of coming here in the 1970s. That very well could be my family in my station wagon. And here we are at the Wax Museum. And the Wax Museum opened in 1962, and just fabulous wax figures of different Civil War scenes. And it was really interesting. I think that at some point people thought that wax museums were hokey. But you got to imagine that this was state of the art when it opened up. And of course they had that battle room diorama. In the 1990s, I actually rewrote that program and provided all the images for that program that they showed on the screen behind it. So it was, my favorite part was getting in there amongst the figures and rearranging them. But I also have photographs of this from my 1976 eighth grade field trip. I'll spare you that though. And of course, early on in 1962, here's the original Jenny Wade exhibit in the Wax Museum. And, you know, originally the wax figures just had curtains behind them. And then they, you know, decorated the walls and made them more elaborate. So here's the Jenny Wade figure from a black and white photograph like 15 years later. And, you know, the Wax Museum closed down. They sold all the figures, but it reemerged as the Gettysburg Heritage Center. And you see that around town a lot, where a museum is opened and then it closes and then it reopens and rebrands as something else. For instance, do you remember the Prince of Peace Wax Museum? I don't know if I saw anything in the history of our town that was stranger than this. But I went into it. I had to check it out. And basically, it was a wax museum that had, you know, scenes pertaining to religious vignettes. And, you know, you might know they put this large, I think they called it a trilon, like a large thing on the front of it, and that's still on that building. And I even have the little description of what the different vignettes that you saw throughout the museum were. Like, they had one of John the Baptist, I remember, and they had one of Jesus on the cross, and they had like the lion's den, Daniel in the lion's den, things like that. Now that closed. That was open for about 10 years, and it closed, and then we had the Samuel Colt Museum at the same location. Do you remember the Samuel Colt Museum? And I don't know if I was into that so much. I don't know, like in that museum, you walked in and there was one wall and there was a pistol. I was like, okay. And then there's another wall and there's a pistol. And I just wasn't interested in pistols enough to be interested in the museum. They did have like a Colt machine gun, from like World War I that I thought was really interesting. And then that closed down, and it became the History Center. See how they use that Trilon, whatever they're calling it there on the advertisement? Now, this diorama, the Gettysburg diorama that's there now, was at Artillery Ridge Campground. And Jim Kralik, a battlefield tour guide, had run that campground, opened that diorama. He bought it from somewhere, and then eventually he bought this building and moved it up to that building. So that's what's in there today. And there's, a gift shop, and there's some other displays. I should tell you, it's worth going in there because in the lobby, they have dioramas that were once in the Charlie Weaver Museum on display in there. Not far from that, right next to Gettysburg Eddie's or the Gingerbread Man, is the old conflict. And again, maybe this is more of an attraction and not a museum, but they had a really cool movie they showed there. The Lincoln Train Museum opened up in the 1960s. Again, as sort of the tour center conglomerate. And it was nice. You got your tickets to go see all the attractions. And if you had kids, then, you could stop at the Lincoln Train Museum. And they basically featured model trains. And you can see all the brochures I have from the Lincoln Train Museum. Yes, you can go in there. It's still, it's a shell of itself and what it used to be. But yes, it's still active. There's a movie. And originally, you went into the Lincoln Train car, and there was a movie screen, and you were on Lincoln's funeral train. And you drove, from Washington out to Springfield. And as you drove along the tracks, and it was filmed on the Ma Railroad between Hanover and the Maryland line. And they had like reenactors you passed, and people waved to you, and they told the story of Lincoln's funeral train. And then Jim Kralik bought it. They changed the movie. And now it's sort of Abraham Lincoln patriotic movie. I do not know how to describe it. You have to experience it for yourself. But they still have like the model railroad and the trains in there. And like I said, this one I would suggest you visit because my take on it is that it's not going to be around for too much longer. So, and some of the things in there are still some of the original items from the 1960s. And here is us again when we went there on a trip. So my mom's hair constantly changed. That's all I remember. And the General Pickett's all-you-can-eat battlefield buffet was originally America at Gettysburg Museum. See the cannon in front of it? And although they had a cafeteria in the back part of it, they focused on a movie in the front, and that was supposed to be like the movie you watched to introduce you to the Battle of Gettysburg before you went out on toward the battlefield. And they also had some really cool dioramas in the building associated with it. It's interesting that diorama there that they advertised was in this museum. I didn't know it was in there. That later is in the Charlie Weaver Museum. And today, that diorama is at the Union Drummer Boy. And it's a diorama of the square of Gettysburg during the battle. But, you probably know General Pickett's went out of business. They moved down the road, rebranded as the Farmhouse Restaurant, Farmhouse Cafeteria. And this sign from the original museum we went over to see what was there in the building, and we got this museum. So in our collection, we try to save things from some of these iconic tourist attractions around town. One of my favorite places, of course, is Fort Defiance. It was there, let me see, I was just looking at it. It was there from 1963 to 1981. And maybe it was a little hokey, but it had like gunfights. Like every once in a while you'd be in the fort and some people would come out and they'd challenge each other and you'd back off and they'd have a little gunfight. And it was basically a series of little buildings inside the fort that had displays of early American weapons and dioramas in it. And you see, and it was right across the street from Meade's headquarters on the Tawnytown Road. And let me ask, how many people were in that? Well, good. So hopefully I'm touching on a little bit of everything for people. Here's a postcard I bought there. Yeah, can you see the little streets of the town, how they would have a little battle there? Here's an advertisement from the newspaper of it, originally, before they had the stockade around it. And then this building, when the Park Service bought the property, they dismantled the building and they rebuilt it. And that building still stands. It is across the entrance from the Eisenhower Inn on the Emmitsburg Road. Do you know where that is? And it's right where Slip and Slide was. And they had plans for it, but it never reopened after they moved. And speaking of short-lived museums, did you know there was a cavalry field museum? I don't know exactly where that was. 2.5 miles east of historic Gettysburg. I think we're talking about out near the Harley dealership. Next to Sandy's restaurant. I remember one time, I think they moved this museum to Low Dutch Road. And I remember seeing a sign there, and I really wanted to go into it, but I never did. The National Tower, 1974 to 2000. And there's, on the left, Thomas Ottenstein from Silver Spring, the designer of the tower. Over 300 feet tall. In 1973, I think it's December 1973, my dad took this photograph of it. So we got a picture of it under construction. And then it was there for many years. I liked it because, obviously they charge money. If you lived in Gettysburg in the 70s and the 80s, in the early 90s, all residents of Gettysburg got to go in everything around town for free. I don't know if anybody still honors that. But here at the top of it, of course, they had different levels. They had a level where you went up in it and you looked out. They had a level where they had a dramatization of the aspects of the battle, and you walked around, looked out the window. John Burns was one of the figures that talked to you in the dramatic narration. Okay, here Walt Lane took a photograph of tourists looking out from the observation deck. That's how we used to dress in the 1970s. I love those hats. Those hats, if I remember correctly, they cost $2. They were made out of like cardboard. Do you remember that the tower had lights? Like the elevator shaft had really cool lights on it at night? And they had a blinking light on the top so that, planes wouldn't hit it. Yeah, not trains. Yeah, here's an image that I took. It's probably my award-winning photograph from the top of the tower, I think in 1992, maybe, looking across the cemeteries in the town. And of course, I collect stuff associated with the tower, brochures and trinkets and stuff. Other little museums around town. The Farnsworth House started off as a museum before as a restaurant. You went up in the attic and they had displays associated with the battle. They had either Loring Schultz or, for a while, Charlie Hathaway dressed as a soldier. And they talked about the battle around the house. Magic Town had a museum. But again, his museum was a store because you could buy everything. But he made diorama buildings in the town. There was a museum called the Confederate States Armory and Museum. It was across from the Holiday Inn. It was in that house that got hit by the car and exploded. But this guy, I forget his name, is really, really interesting guy. He had been a professional basketball player, like in the 1940s. But he had just Confederate rifles and swords and accoutrements on display. And there's other museums I'm not talking about, like the Blue and Gray Museum that was near the Holiday Inn for a while. Of course, the Shriver House Museum that has been around since the 1990s, and today the Adams County Historical Society, runs that museum. And they've had pretty good success over the years telling the civilian story of the battle. The Gettysburg Museum of History on Baltimore Street has a large collection of artifacts dealing with various wars on display. And just some other modern museums, that we have. The Seminary Ridge Museum opened in 2013 on the seminary campus. The Lomas Center. It's basically a museum that covers the history of reenacting, and it covers a lot of armory displays. They have arms and accoutrements on display, and that's in the alley behind the Farnsworth House. Lomas had died, and they opened that up in his honor. The Civil War Tales Diorama Museum, I highly recommend that. That's the museum where they have little dioramas of Civil War battles, except all the figures are cats, kitty cats. The Thad Stevens Museum. And, I think it should be a game when a museum opens up. How long is it going to last? Because these museums do come and go and come and go. The foundation opened up a museum. What was it called? Ticket to the Past at the railroad station. Did anybody go to that? They had virtual reality glasses you put on and headphones, and you were in a vignette for Basil Biggs, I remember, or there were some other people associated with the battle. I only did Basil Biggs twice. Do you know that's gone? It's out of business and it's gone. Yeah, it's not coming back. Another museum that is probably not going to be there much longer is the Battlefield Military Museum. So, some other people have hats. You should put your hat on. Everybody should put their hat on. And someone recently, today, donated or gave us some items from that museum. That's the one run by the Marinos family. And George Marinos, I remember him really well. Met him when I first started coming here in the 70s. But I think he opened up the museum in the 60s. And this spring on Saturdays, I think this may still be open. It's fascinating inside. But again, it's one man's private collection. And Civil War Trust purchased the property, or American Battlefield Trust, that it sits on. And they're going to either move the artifacts or sell them in a massive auction. So I guess that remains to be seen. But, they gave us some really cool hats. What year do you think these hats are from? I doubt if they'd make something like that in the 80s. Got to be 70s. But I just think that's awesome. Yes, eventually. These things, they don't happen right away. But I think when the trust gets a hold of that land and tears down the building, it'll be more like a picnic grounds, for the, going on the co-op sale, and the trust will be to use it. So we also, I should mention that if you want to learn more about some of the things we talked about in our program, we do have a Facebook site called Tourism Tuesdays. We can get on there and you can look and see what we're highlighting about tourism. We try to highlight all aspects of tourism, like motels, or like, the miniature golf course that was established in 1931 at what is now the Upper Crust. Did you know there was an indoor miniature golf course there at that location, run by the Epleys? Or sometimes we'll handle some bit of museum or tourism that's in a different location, like the original Mr. Ed's Elephant Museum before it was at its current location. This is going up Route 30 to the top of the mountain on Route 30, what we call TikTok, and it's on the right. Those buildings, you can still see where they used to stand. I think this one still stands. Or I was going to mention that in the next installment I do on my commercialization program is going to be motels and hotels. So you can learn about all the motels. The Battlefield Motel. Yeah. This is something I've always said. Not only do they desecrate the battlefield by building a motel on it, but they name the motel after the thing they're desecrating. I get a kick out of that. That was on the Emmitsburg Road, just north of the Sherfy, north of the Sherfy house. And then, of course, I'll probably cover now campgrounds. Does everybody know that there used to be a Yogi Bear Jellystone Park campground in Gettysburg? Good. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming to my program.